Hello, everyone. My name is Paul, and I look after behavioral finance for Momentum Investments. Now, today we're going to be talking about a very interesting field which has risen to prominence in the last 2 decades or so called neuroeconomics. And neuroeconomics began probably in the mid-1990s with the work of Paul Glimcher, who's an economist as well as a neuroscientist, and decided to combine those two fields to help him understand how and why people make the choices that they do. Now, there's a lot of terminologies that are floating around that are often used interchangeably. So let's quickly just discuss what that means. So there's behavioral economics, which combines economic theory with psychology, right, to get a bit closer to a better descriptive model of people's choices. There's behavioral finance, which combines psychology with finance theory, so to understand financial decisions a little bit more. And then there's neuroeconomics, which takes all of that and adds another 2 dimensions, which is the brain, in other words, neurobiology. So what's happening between our ears when we make these decisions, and then also considers the environment as well. So more of a sociological point of view or perspective. And if we put all of these things in a melting pot, we get this field called neuroeconomics, which we're going to be chatting about today, which is very interesting. So like everything, behavioral finance as well has undergone a metamorphosis and is evolving to the point where we're not too concerned anymore about this concept of rationality and biases. Right? So behavioral finance rose, with the objective basically of explaining why markets are not efficient. Right? So markets are supposed to be efficient. They're not because of the psychological biases that we're predisposed to. And if you go into Wikipedia, you'll see that there's a heck of a long list, about over 200 biases. But of course, that doesn't really help anyone, right? So we've moved away from this obsession of rational versus irrational. So Spock, Homer Simpson, hyper-rational Mr. Spock, who's able to take 10 decisions, lay them out in his head, calculated the expected values and associated probabilities, maximize his utility by picking the biggest number, versus Homer Simpson, who just wants a beer and a donut, right? So he's hyper emotional and just was very prone to this whole immediate gratification thing, right? So life is all about the now. And of course, we actually don't identify with either of these archetypes, actually, right? Because it's not as simple as that. I mean, we're Homer Simpson in some situations, and then not again in the same situation. We're Spock in other situations, and then not again in those situations. So all these different contexts really have a big impact in terms of when we're able to be rational and not. So I think behavioral finance has really evolved to the point where we're really trying to understand human beings a lot better. And that's really why today I'm talking about neuroeconomics, because it gives us these other lenses that we can look at, at financial decisions through, for example, to understand the behavior a little bit better. So if we look at a basic neuroeconomic model, excuse me, you'll see that in the middle of the screen there, you'll see that is pretty much that person's brain. So we don't want to get rid of finance and economic theory, right? Finance and economic theory is extremely important because it gives us an idea of what the goalposts look like. So what are we aiming for? We shouldn't just say, well, human beings are not rational, so finance and economic theory is useless. It's very useful because it gives us an idea of exactly what the goalposts are. And then when we miss those goals, neuroeconomics, excuse me, gives us these different fields that we can look at to help us explain why we missed those goals. So there are 3 dimensions to this basic neuroeconomic model that I'm going to be chatting about today. And the first one is neurobiology, which is something I've already alluded to, which is what is happening in between our ears when we make the choice. What does the chemical composition look like, and what parts of our brain are being used when we make those decisions? The second is personality. So personality, which is very closely tied, by the way, to neurobiology, simply because we inherit, or our genetic makeup is passed down to us from generation to generation. So our personality factory settings come through our genes. And then, of course, what happens is, that's the final one that's just popped up now, the environment is going to be a moderating effect on our personality. So in the nature versus nurture debate, the answer is overwhelmingly nature. We inherit our factory settings and our personality traits from our parents, but our environment has a moderating effect on those personality traits. And that really is the important consideration here. So this is a very, very elementary and basic neuroeconomic model, but it helps us to have a really, really cool discussion around, looking at financial decisions with with these other lenses can help us really understand and describe those decisions a little bit better. So if we start off with neurobiology, why you want to trust your gut. So if you look in the top left hand, the top left of the diagram, those are all the happiness chemicals, right? So endorphins are your natural painkiller, right? So when you go to gym, for example, right, that you feel really, really great afterwards, and all your pain receptors are actually dumbed down a little bit. So, you don't feel pain after gym. Serotonin is your natural mood stabilizer. So a good life hack there, if you walk in a bloody beautiful green forest, or you take a walk on a beach, for example, that calm Zen feeling that you get, that is from an increase in your serotonin levels. Oxytocin is your love and trust bonding hormone, right? So that feeling you get when you hold someone's hand or you look deep into their eyes, it's that kind of connection, bonding that we're biologically, by the way, that obviously is important, because we need to be in an environment where the people that we're with, we trust them, right? And we think that they have our best interests at heart. And then finally, dopamine, which is a very, very powerful reward chemical, and very, very closely associated to financial behavior as well. So those are your happiness chemicals. On the flip side of that coin, though, are stress chemicals. Now, from a financial point of view, that is extremely important. So let's have a look biologically at what happens, for example, when you go through a stress response. So you'll see that the two white circles that have popped onto the screen now, you'll see the larger one, that it really shows you your midbrain or your limbic system, right? And that is your center for fear and risk. The slightly smaller circle to the left shows your prefrontal cortex, and we're going to sort of discuss now how this comes into play when there is a stress response. So when there's a stress response, what's going to happen is your pituitary gland is going to, which is in block 2, or rather the magnified piece there, or circle 2, is going to release a signal, and it's going to release a signal to your adrenal cortex, which sits just above your kidneys, which is going to give you a physiological response to the stress, right? So you're going to have sweaty palms, maybe dilated pupils, elevated heart rate. And what's going to happen is that the signal is going to be to release cortisol into your bloodstream. And what's going to happen is when cortisol flows through your bloodstream, it affects your cognition, right? So it affects what's happening in that smaller circle on the left of your screens there. And what it basically does is cortisol, which has been shown by the Wharton Business School, is going to make you more predisposed to rely on your gut instinct. So you're going to stop thinking about stuff logically, right? So stop the whole Spock thing, and you're going to rely on past experiences. So what has worked in the past? And biologically, this makes perfect sense, right? So I mean, if you're in the herd and someone starts running, it's probably better not to ask questions about why that's happening. It's probably better to run as well. And that would have worked in the past. So you would rely on that experience just to basically trigger the fight or flight, right? And in that case, you might decide that flight is the best thing, and you'll think about it a little bit later. From a financial context, though, or point of view, this doesn't really help us a lot, because what happens is we often react instinctively to those market stimuli, and we end up making decisions in the moment that have longer term consequences for our investment portfolio. So biologically, or from a neurobiology point of view, there's a very, very strong link here between or to financial behavior as well. We can just talk about dopamine for a second as well. I mean, there's very, very strong links between dopamine and reward. And that gambling, there was a very good paper done by Hans Breiter and the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman as well. And basically Hans Breiter, who's a neuroscientist, realized that exactly the same centers in your brain are lighting up when you make financial decisions, risk, reward, payoff decisions. Exactly the same centers are lighting up with cocaine addicts, right? So it's this anticipation of reward that that really gets that dopamine hit, which is a very, very powerful motivator of behavior as well. So these chemicals matter in terms of, or in respect to the financial decisions that we make as well. Now, there's a very, very good link here, and we can just talk about this very, very quickly. You'll see some facts and figures popping up on your screens now. So you might be surprised to know that you actually have a second brain. So in your main brain, you've got about 85 billion neurons. Your second brain, about 500 million neurons. Your second brain is in your gut. So it's your enteric nervous system, right? 100 million neurotransmitters sit in this region, 40 million neurotransmitters in your second brain, which is in your gut. Now, here's the interesting bit. So half of dopamine production happens in your brain. The other half happens in your gut. 5% of serotonin, only 5% of serotonin manufacturing happens in your brain. 95% happens in your gut. So there are very, very strong links that are now being discovered between gut health and mental health, for example. So if your gut health, if you have malfunctions in your gut, for example, it's going to affect the happiness chemicals that you're able to produce, and that is going to affect not just your normal behavior, it's going to affect your financial behavior as well. So very, very interesting links that are now being made between gut health and things like Parkinson's disease. Dopamine production, by the way, is very, very central, or very, very important if we look at links to Parkinson's disease as well. So very interesting, advancements that are being made and discoveries that are being made that are also helping us discover, or rather make links to financial behavior as well. And this really is why neuroeconomics is so important, because it's bringing these discoveries into, not just medicine and biology, it's also bringing these things into the field of economics as well. The second one is personality, right? So personality is, the set of characteristic behaviors or traits that make you. So when people say you're behaving out of character, that just means that you're behaving differently to what they would expect, basically. And your personality, because of the fact that these are, characteristics or traits, and you do them more than you don't do them, it just means that they are long-term and relatively stable in nature, unless there's some kind of trauma. But it's also been discovered that personality has a very, very strong link to financial behavior as well. So let's just quickly go through these traits on your screen now. You'll see that sort of at 12 o'clock, if we look at openness in the dark blue there, people who are open to new experiences, for example, from a financial behavior point of view, excuse me, if you're open to new experiences, it means you want to live life now. And if you want to live life now, you want to skydive, you want to bungee jump, for example, it also means that you are very present orientated, and therefore you're not as future orientated, which means that you save less and you spend more, for example. So it's a very strong links here, again, to risk taking as well. So people who are open to new experiences, generally speaking, are risk seeking by nature. Conscientiousness, excuse me, these are the kids who left the marshmallow on the table, right? They were able to develop these little techniques. If you've watched the Stanford marshmallow experiment, you would see that some kids were looking to the corner of the room, tapping their fingers on the table, covering the marshmallow. These were the kids that were able to, they were more future oriented. So they were able to focus on the reward and not live in the now, like eat the marshmallow now, right? And very, very strong links again between conscientiousness and saving behavior. So people who are future orientated save more. Extroversion, right? So the life of the party, for example. These are people who are quite risk-seeking by nature, right? So think about people who don't mind, they perceive less risk, for example, in things like cryptocurrency. People who are agreeable, those are the people who are social and relational. They're quite empathetic. There are people, for example, who are more inclined for, more on the emotive sense. So we're actually doing some work at the moment to see if there's any links between agreeableness and ESG, for example, ESG preferences. So people who are agreeable, for example, are quite empathetic, as we've discussed now, and they might get a different benefit from investing in terms of the impact that investing is having on their environment, for example. And then neuroticism is the bad one. So that's linked to pathological behavior. So neuroticism is the anxiety, right? So the nail biters amongst us that are going to perceive more situations as a threat. And these are the people that are going to have elevated levels of cortisol in their bloodstreams. And that's why it's a pathological or a bad trait, because people who are under fight or flight a lot more, from a biological point of view, they're under stress a lot more, right? And stress is not a very, very good, it's not a healthy place to be, let's put it that way. Now, there's also some very, very strong links here between personality and genetics as well. So don't worry too much about this. There's quite a lot of detail on the screen there, but 5-HTT basically is your serotonin transporter, right? Or in your, if we go to a very, very elementary lesson on genetics, 5-HTT is your serotonin transporter. If you look at the 5-HTT LPR on the left-hand side of your screen there, that's what's called a polymorphism. So it's a little bit of a wonky, something is not quite right in kind of encoding that serotonin transporter, which basically means that you get a different signal that means you don't get enough serotonin production, which means that there's a tighter relationship there to neuroticism, which is the personality trait, which again results in anxiety, right? Amygdala, remember we talked about that, is the center that activates the flight or fight. So now you can see how all these things are connected, right? So genetics, if there's a polymorphism or something that's not getting the correct signal in terms of serotonin production, that is going to put you under a lot more stress, which again is going to have a link to financial behavior. So all of these things are most definitely connected. And then finally, we're going to talk about this this concept of you are a product of your time and tribe. So it's your environment also has a very, very big impact on your behavior as well. So from a biological point of view, the biggest risk to you, many hundreds of years ago, was being excommunicated from your tribe, right? So your chances of survival out in the wild were a lot less if you were separated from your tribe. In other words, if they kicked you out. And that's why basically, things like behavior in a social context, things like morals, for example, develop from a biological point of view, because if you're going to do, you want to do stuff that the tribe is going to accept. If you're going to display sort of antisocial behavior, the tribe is going to kick you out. So moral kind of development is has a very strong biological root as well. So things like gossip, for example, are biologically very important, and that's why they feel good. Again, there's a link to dopamine here. So gossip feels good. We gossip because it feels good, because it's a way of uncovering, or rather discovering, where we stand in the tribe. Do people like us? Don't they like us? Because if people like us, we're more likely to be or stay in the tribe. So it feels good when other people say good things about us. And there's obviously links there to social standing and comparisons as well. We want to be, we want to be in good social standing, and we want to compare ourselves as well to other members of the tribe to determine where we are in the social hierarchy. Again, which lowers the chances of us being excommunicated from our tribe. So, when we say you're a product of your time, that's also very, very important, right? Because the era or time that you grow up in has a very, very marked impact on your behavior as well. So if we think about Gen Zs, for example, right? So those are the Zoomers, or rather, some people call them the Zoomers, right? So those are the youngsters around us who have grown up in a very, very different time, right? So think about, for example, their view on banks. Right, so for a Gen Xer like me, for example, banks what we see as the paragon of security, right? But Gen Zs are like, but hang on a second, we grew up in global financial crisis. Banks are not secure. In actual fact, banks can be the cause of all our problems. So we don't view banks the same way as our parents did and their parents did, for example. Zoomers have grown up, or Gen Zs have grown up, the digital natives, right? So the internet is ubiquitous; it's everywhere. So you have got your milk in your fridge, and there's a weight sensor under that milk. It's connected to the internet. So when your milk dips below 30%, there's an email, or rather a signal, that's sent to your nearest grocer, and before you know it, there's a milk has popped up on your doorstep again. So perhaps we're not quite that sophisticated in South Africa, but there are definitely parts of the world where that is already happening. Right? It's already actually it's not really that surprising at all. They're also the loneliest generation, right? So it's this concept of being alone together. So I don't know if you've seen this before, but you've got these groups of people who sit on their phones together and only communicate with their phones even when the person is next to them. And of course, the reason for that is that they're communicating with other people around the world. So to actually talk to each other would be rude, because the other people around the world aren't privy to the same conversation. So we all need to be on a level with the same playing field. And then we see, of course, that Zoomers, for example, are very shrewd customers, very present oriented, right? So we have GFC, and a decade or so later, just a little bit more than a decade later, you get hit by COVID. So there's been no real sort of boom period for the Zoomers, right? It's been an era of a lot more stress, and this impacts their view on things like risk, for example. So we might be surprised that people are buying cryptos. And I think in South Africa, we see that about 10% of South Africans at the moment are invested in crypto, and that's, it's rising, right? And 43% of that 10% are Zoomers. So those are your Gen Z. So they don't have that level or perception of risk when it comes to things like cryptocurrency. So if we're going to understand financial decisions, for example, the time period that this person is growing up in is very, very, very important, right? Because they have different views on things like stocks, for example, and different views on things like crypto, for example. So that has a very, very big impact in terms of their investment decisions. And if we're going to try and understand those investment decisions. And that really is the important part. And that's a good sort of, a good note to end off on as well. So how neuroeconomics is helping us is it's giving us new tools and techniques to understand decision-making a lot better. And also it's going to advance to a point, if we think of, COVID, for example, has decreased the cost of genetic sequencing already quite a lot, right? Because of all the attention that was placed on sequencing during the pandemic and coming up with a vaccine. So we could very, very, very easily see a situation in the future where a risk profile is actually done with a finger prick blood test. Very, very strong links between biases, and your personality markers in your genetics, right? So people who have the DRD4 gene, for example, are generally speaking have a certain risk profile. And these things we're discovering are coming through genetic code as well. So you're getting very, very strong predictors in genetics of how people are likely to make financial decisions as well. And this really is the new world that we're moving to. And I think really a good place to stop here, but such a fascinating place or that we're moving into as we start to bring in these multiple disciplines to understand how and why people are making their investment decisions. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll see you all again soon. Thank you.